Wanted to spend a little bit of time highlighting some of the key points from the Paris package. Now, I'm going to make available to you hard copies of the Paris Agreement so you can have a look at this in detail yourselves. But just to look at some of the highlights, one of the important points was what would be the objective of the parties in terms of a limitation of global average temperature rises. Would it be, as some parties contended, a commitment to not exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius, or would it be something higher? One block of parties, supported by a number of small Pacific Island nations, but also some other countries, were very strongly arguing that the parties to the convention should be committing to measures which would limit global average temperature rises to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. That's the level at which scientists tell us would have a reasonable prospect of avoiding sea level rises that would completely swamp some of those low-lying Pacific nations and other low-lying parts of the world. Other countries, including, it should be said, New Zealand, thought that given the volume of emissions which are already in the atmosphere, that it was simply unrealistic to be recording a commitment to achieve global average temperature rises of no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius, and it would be more realistic and better to include a temperature rise of no more than 2 degrees Celsius. Now, in the end, some sort of compromise was reached where countries agreed to aim for well below 2 degrees Celsius, but aiming for 1.5 degrees Celsius. And that's recorded in Article 2. Second important point was that the parties agreed to peak global greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible. No specific date or time frame was mentioned there, but that there would be an aim to achieve a balance between anthropogenic emissions and removals by sinks in the second half of the century. Now, again, that's been criticised by a number of parties, including some of the leading NGOs, who believe that the absence of a specific time frame will allow too much flexibility and doesn't represent as ambitious a target as is necessary to avoid dangerous impacts of climate change. Nevertheless, that's what we have. Supplementing that a little vague commitment are 5-year cycles for NDCs, or nationally determined contributions, which are the documents by which individual sovereign states record their particular climate change emissions reductions commitments, and those cycles of reconsidering the NDCs will take place every 5 years, informed by a global stocktake, which is a review of the level of ambition at a particular time against the scientific information which is available. Some parties to the Paris negotiations were very anxious for a number of sectors which have hitherto remained outside of the UN FCCC framework to be included, and that includes aviation and shipping. The ultimate result of that was that aviation and shipping remain outside of the UN FCCC framework and the Paris Agreement. There are separate international bodies who are looking at ways in which emissions from aviation and shipping might be reduced. I mentioned the concept of a global stocktake earlier. There will be a first collective stocktake in 2018. That's next year, where there will be an overview or a review of the various commitments that are made by countries, as I mentioned before, against the latest scientific information which is available at that time. And then there will be a first formal global stocktake under the agreement in 2023, which comes, as I've noted on the slide, with a ratchet up mechanism. One of the key themes of the Paris Agreement is that although each country is able to make voluntary commitments for emissions reductions, each commitment should represent an increase in ambition on the previous commitment. that's sometimes called this ratchet up mechanism. One of the themes that I've talked about previously under the UNFCCC is that developed country parties, and that includes New Zealand, should take the lead in climate change mitigation and adaptation measures, and that continues to be reflected in the agreement under Article 4.4. One of the potentially controversial issues is the question of financial contributions, particularly from developed countries to developing countries, and this has been a perennial source of disagreement among parties to the Convention and the Kyoto Protocol and now the Paris Agreement. What the Paris package included was maintenance of a commitment which had been made earlier in Copenhagen in 2009 for parties to, or developed country parties, to be contributing and facilitating $100 billion per year for climate change mitigation and adaptation projects. That will be maintained, but prior to 2025 there will be a review and a commitment to setting a new collective quantified goal which will be no less than $100 billion per year. Now that $100 billion per year contribution is something fixed upon by President Trump, who regards it as unnecessary and inappropriate that countries such as the United States should be contributing to climate change efforts elsewhere in the world. I will talk a little bit more about loss and damage separately, but this is another area where there has been a lot of debate in the negotiations. Loss and damage is a phrase in the climate change negotiations which refers to the possible obligations, particularly falling on developed countries, not only to assist countries in adapting to the impacts of climate change, but for those impacts which might not be able to be adapted to assist with some sort of quasi-compensation mechanism, although the word compensation is explicitly ruled out, where developed countries contribute money and other resources to vulnerable developing countries to assist in coping with the impacts of climate change. As is noted there on the slide, support directed towards minimizing and averting loss and damage, such as early warning systems and emergency preparedness. I'll talk about that a little bit later. Finally, I wanted to mention the provision within the Paris Agreement for what are called internationally transferred mitigation outcomes. Now, this is the new jargon for international emissions trading, where, as I've previously explained under the Kyoto Protocol, it's possible for countries to outsource their emissions reductions. This is likely to be a mechanism used by New Zealand to some extent, where New Zealand will in effect purchase emissions reductions from other countries where it might be possible to be reducing carbon emissions at a cheaper rate than New Zealand, where with our existing high level of renewable energy already and the difficulty at the moment of reducing emissions from sectors such as agriculture, it's more expensive to do so.